It started as just another day on a quiet country road. Two police officers stood by their patrol car, joking around, their laughter echoing under the bright sun. But their humor quickly turned cruel when they saw a man walking toward them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His dark skin and sharp suit made him stand out, and for the officers, that was all the invitation they needed. They didn't know his name, and they didn't care. To them, he was just someone they could mess with, someone they thought wouldn't dare fight back. The officers began taunting him, their words laced with mockery and disrespect. They made jokes, laughed at their own insults, and even tried to intimidate him. But the man didn't flinch. He stood there, calm and steady, his face revealing nothing. What they saw as arrogance was something entirely different, a man who knew his worth and wasn't about to stoop to their level. Still, the officers pressed on, trying to provoke a reaction, enjoying the twisted sense of power they thought they held. What they didn't realize was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. This wasn't just any man passing through. This was someone who held more authority than they could imagine, someone who had the power to change everything. In a few short hours, their world was about to be turned upside down, and the man they had ridiculed would soon be sitting in the very office they answered to. But before that moment came, they continued their mockery, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing. Little did they know, the joke was about to be on them, and when the truth was revealed, it would leave them speechless. The man remained silent as the officers continued their tirade, their laughter growing louder with each passing moment. They mocked his suit, his posture, even the way he stood there so calmly, as if he wasn't bothered by their words. It was almost as if they wanted to push him, to get a rise out of him, to prove some twisted point. But instead of reacting, he simply adjusted his tie and glanced at the horizon, his expression unreadable. The officers couldn't understand why he wasn't fighting back. It only made them try harder to break him. What they didn't know was that this man had faced far worse in his life. He had worked his way up from nothing, navigating a system that wasn't built to help people like him succeed. Every insult they threw at him, every stereotype they tried to pin on him, he had heard it all before. And yet, he had risen above it, using those moments of adversity to fuel his determination. He didn't need to prove anything to these two officers. He already knew exactly who he was, and soon they would too. As the minutes passed, the officers began to grow restless, frustrated by his silence. They exchanged glances, wondering why their usual tactics weren't working. To them, he was just another nameless face, another target for their amusement. They had no idea that their actions were digging them into a deeper hole, one they couldn't climb out of. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Are you finished?" he asked, his tone carrying an authority that caught them off guard. The officers paused, unsure how to respond. Before they could figure it out, their radios crackled with a message that would change everything. The officers exchanged uneasy glances as the radio message buzzed through the air. It was a call from the station, but the static made it hard to hear. The man in the suit stood silently, his calm gaze fixed on them as if he already knew what was about to happen. The laughter and bravado from moments before were gone now, replaced by a faint sense of unease. They couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, though they didn't know why. Meanwhile, the man's mind was steady, replaying the events that had led him to this moment. He had spent weeks preparing for his new role, determined to bring change to a department plagued by problems it refused to acknowledge. He knew walking into this job wouldn't be easy. He had heard the whispers, seen the dismissive glances during his interviews. But nothing could have prepared him for this kind of welcome, being reduced to a joke on his first day simply because of who he was. The officers, still unaware of the weight of their actions, tried to brush off their nerves. One of them reached for the radio, attempting to clarify the garbled message. "Could you repeat that?" he asked, his voice unusually shaky. The response came through more clearly this time. It was an announcement, welcoming the department's new chief. The man's name echoed across the frequency, and both officers froze, their faces draining of color as they turned to look at him. He didn't say a word, letting the realization sink in. Their expressions shifted from confusion to panic as it dawned on them. The man they had ridiculed, the one they had treated with so little respect, wasn't just passing through. He was here to lead, and he had seen everything. The silence that followed the radio announcement was deafening. The officers stood frozen, their once confident smirks now replaced with wide eyes and slack jaws. It was as if time had stopped, the weight of their mistake crushing down on them all at once. The man remained calm, his gaze unwavering, his presence commanding without him having to say a word. The tension in the air was thick, every second stretching longer than the last. One of the officers stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to salvage the situation. Chief, we didn't realize. But his words trailed off as he looked into the man's eyes, realizing there was no excuse that could erase what had just happened. The other officer, still holding the radio, took a step back, his face pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The reality of what they had done, the insults, the mockery, the sheer disrespect, was now inescapable. The man finally broke the silence, his tone measured and steady. "So this is how you represent the badge?" he asked, his words cutting through the air like a blade. The officers flinched, their guilt written all over their faces. He didn't need to raise his voice to make an impact. The sheer authority in his calmness was enough. He stepped forward, closing the space between them, and the officers instinctively stepped back, suddenly feeling small in the presence of the man they had underestimated. The road seemed eerily quiet now, the wind rustling through the trees the only sound. The man looked at them for a long moment, letting the weight of his silence speak volumes. Then, without warning, he turned and began walking toward the patrol car. The officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to follow or stay put. Every step he took seemed to intensify their dread, the anticipation of what was coming next almost unbearable. They knew there would be consequences, but they had no idea just how far-reaching they would be. The officers hesitated for a moment, then scrambled to follow him, their boots crunching on the gravel as they tried to keep up. Their nerves were frayed, their minds racing with questions. What was he going to do? Would he report them immediately? Could this ruin their careers? They had no answers, only a growing sense of dread as they approached their patrol car. The man stopped beside the car, his gaze sweeping over it, then turned to face them. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone seemed to demand the truth. "Tell me," he said calmly, "is this how you treat everyone who does?" The two officers stood frozen as the captain approached, his expression hard and unforgiving. He stopped in front of the man in the suit, who still exuded the same calm authority that had left them shaken. The captain extended a hand. "Welcome to the team, Chief. I'm sorry you had to experience this on your first day," he said firmly, throwing a sharp glance at the two officers. The man nodded but didn't return the smile. "Thank you, Captain. I'm here to make sure things like this don't go unchecked," he replied, his words deliberate and heavy. The officers' hearts sank. They had hoped for a reprimand, maybe even a stern talking to, but this was far worse. They had been exposed not just as bullies, but as representatives of a broken system, right in front of their new boss. The captain turned to the officers, his tone cold. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've humiliated this department on the very day we're supposed to be moving forward under his leadership." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Both of you will face immediate disciplinary action. Consider this the start of a very long road to rebuilding any trust you've just shattered." The officers stammered apologies, but the chief raised a hand to silence them. "It's not just about apologies. This is about accountability. You've shown me exactly what needs to change here, and I will make sure it does, starting with you." Just when it seemed like the punishment was set, the chief stepped closer, his eyes sharp. "One more thing," he added, his voice low but firm. "Tomorrow morning, you'll report directly to me. We're going to revisit every single complaint ever filed under your names." The officers' faces went pale. They realized the reckoning was just beginning, and as the chief turned and walked away, leaving the captain to deal with their immediate suspension, one thing was clear: this wasn't just about their mistakes. It was about creating a department that finally lived up to its badge. The officers stood in stunned silence as the chief walked away, his presence leaving an indelible mark on them. They had been so certain of their power, so sure that no one would ever hold them accountable. But in a single afternoon, everything had changed. The weight of their actions, paired with the chief's calm but unyielding demeanor, left them with no choice but to confront what they had done. Back at the station, word spread quickly. The new chief's unshakable stance on integrity and fairness was already reshaping the culture, even before his official introduction to the rest of the department. Officers who had grown complacent suddenly found themselves questioning their own actions, wondering if they'd be next under his scrutiny. Others who had long hoped for a change in leadership felt a renewed sense of hope. The ripple effect had begun. Later that evening, the chief sat in his office, reviewing files late into the night. He wasn't doing this for revenge or personal vindication. He was doing it to ensure that no one else would ever have to face what he had endured. For too long, the badge had been used as a shield for bad behavior, but under his leadership, it would become a symbol of service and respect again. As the sun began to rise, the chief glanced out of his window, taking in the quiet morning. He thought about the road ahead. Challenging, yes, but worth every effort. This wasn't just a job for him, it was a mission. And as he closed one file and opened the next, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever. The officers who had mocked him had learned their lesson the hard way, but the real victory lay in the transformation that had only just begun. Change was coming, and this time, it would stick.